The Glassblower's Night, a rhythmic sleep story of fading heat and rest. The light in the studio had turned to honey. Jasper set down his blowpipe for the last time that day, feeling the weight leave his hands like a held breath finally released. Through the tall, dusty windows on the western wall, the sun was performing its slow descent, casting everything in shades of amber and rust. Particles of glass dust hung suspended in the air, each one catching the light, turning the studio into something close to snow globe magic. He'd been working since 7 that morning, and his shoulders carried the evidence, a deep, satisfying ache that spoke of effort and attention, of hours spent in conversation with fire and silica and breath. He removed his safety glasses and the world shifted slightly, colors intensifying without the tinted protection. There were glass shards everywhere, of course. Tiny rainbows scattered across the concrete floor, remnants of the day's work. A broken stem from a wine glass, shavings from where he'd cold worked a vase rim. The studio always looked like a very beautiful, very dangerous confetti had been scattered by some celebratory giant. But now came the shift, the transition, the moment when doing gave way to being. Jasper remained on his wooden stool worn smooth by years of sitting, the seat shaped precisely to his form, and simply observed. The furnace still glowed orange in the corner, but he'd turned it down to its overnight temperature. The heat that had dominated the space for hours, that 2,000-degree beast that demanded respect and caution, was slowly retreating. The studio's temperature was dropping degree by degree, and with it, the quality of the air changed. The fierce, dry heat that had pulled moisture from his skin was softening into something more forgiving. He used to resist this moment. 3 years ago, before the burnout, before the trembling hands and the insomnia and the doctor's appointment where he wept unexpectedly in the examination room, he would have pushed through this golden hour, would have pulled another gather of molten glass from the furnace, would have started one more piece, would have told himself that rest was something you earned only after complete exhaustion. Productivity was a fire you fed constantly, or so he'd believed. Now he understood differently. Now he honored the transition. The studio seemed to sigh with him as the day released its grip. Jasper stood slowly, his knees making small sounds of protest, a reminder that he was 47 now, not the 27-year-old who could blow glass for 14 hours straight and feel invincible, and walked toward the annealing oven. The kiln sat against the north wall, an insulated metal box roughly the size of a small refrigerator, its door closed, its purpose singular and patient. He opened the door just a crack. Heat waves shimmered out like visible breath, and even standing 2 feet back, he felt the warmth wash over his face. Inside, arranged on shelves lined with kiln paper, sat today's creations, 6 pieces total. 2 small vessels with twisted handles, a shallow bowl intended for a customer's entryway table, a pair of goblets that were meant to be identical, but had developed their own personalities in the making, as glass often did, an experimental sculpture, an attempt at capturing the feeling of wind, all curves and movement frozen in transparent blue. The glass still glowed faintly, not the fierce orange of molten working temperature, but a softer, deeper red, like embers settling into themselves, still too hot to touch, still dangerous, but no longer liquid, no longer malleable. The shaping was done. Now came the annealing. This was the part most people didn't understand about glassblowing. They saw the fire, the drama, the glowing gather of molten glass on the end of the pipe. They saw the breath and the spin and the quick, decisive movements that determined whether a piece succeeded or failed. That was the performance, the visible magic. But the real transformation, the process that determined whether glass became permanent or shattered into disappointment, happened here, in this quiet box, over hours and hours of carefully controlled cooling. Glass, Jasper had learned, holds memory in its molecular structure. When you heat it to liquid and then shape it, you create stress. The outside cools faster than the inside. Different thicknesses cool at different rates. If you simply pulled a finished piece from the heat and let it cool at room temperature, those internal stresses would tear it apart, sometimes immediately, sometimes days later, for no apparent reason, just a sudden crack appearing across a bowl you thought was finished and safe. Annealing was the answer. The slow, controlled cool down that allowed the molecules to relax, to settle into their new configuration without tension. You brought the glass up to a specific temperature, different for different types of glass, and then lowered the temperature gradually, degree by degree, over hours. For these pieces, probably 8 to 10 hours total. Overnight, while he slept, the kiln would do its patient work. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't force it. You could only trust the process and wait. Jasper closed the kiln door gently, hearing the soft click of the latch. He'd set the controller earlier, programming the cooling curve into its digital brain. Now there was nothing to do but let time do what time does best: pass slowly, thoroughly, without shortcuts. He thought about the therapy appointment 3 years ago, after the burnout had gotten so bad he couldn't hold a coffee cup without his hands shaking. Dr. Rayna, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, had listened to him describe his schedule, his drive, his belief that stopping meant failing. "You're annealing wrong," she'd said finally. He'd blinked at her. "What? You know how glass works. You understand it intimately. But you're treating yourself like you can just run hot all the time, and then collapse into cold, and somehow be fine. That's not how humans work either. We need controlled cool down, regular rest. The annealing hour isn't optional, Jasper. It's when we become permanent instead of brittle." The metaphor had hit him like a small stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. Now, standing in his studio as the light faded from honey to rose gold, he understood it in his bones. The most important part of his day wasn't the fire or the shaping. It was this: the cooling down, the settling. The moment when he stopped demanding things of himself and simply existed in the space he'd created. From across the studio came the first sound. Tink, Jasper, smiled. The goblet one of the pair was cooling, contracting microscopically, and as it did, it sang. A tiny, high-pitched note, almost musical, like a miniature bell being tapped with a miniature hammer. The sound of glass settling into itself. He walked to his chair, not the work stool, but the reading chair, a beaten leather thing he'd rescued from a curb 7 years ago, its arms worn pale, its seat permanently shaped to him, and lowered himself into it. He didn't turn on music, didn't reach for his phone, didn't fill the silence with podcasts or videos or the background noise he used to think was companionship. He just listened. Learning to sit with quiet had been harder than mastering any technical glassblowing skill. In the months after the burnout, when Dr. Rayna had assigned him homework, 20 minutes a day of simply sitting without input, he felt like his skin was trying to crawl off his body. The silence had been so loud it hurt. His brain had thrown every anxious thought it could manufacture at him, trying to get him to move, to do, to produce. But he'd persisted. 20 minutes became 30. 30 became this whole evenings in the studio, listening to nothing and everything. Tink, tink, tink. The goblets were having a conversation. The bowl joined in with a lower tone, a soft plink that resonated differently. Glass of different thicknesses cooled at different rates, creating different sounds. It was random and unpredictable and absolutely beautiful. This was his favorite symphony, the music of transformation happening invisibly, one molecule at a time. After several minutes of listening, Jasper stood again. His body knew the evening ritual now, moved through it like a meditation. He reached for his push broom. The broom was old, its bristles made of actual horsehair, a gift from another glassblower who'd been retiring. The handle was smooth wood, darkened by years of hands, fitted with a natural curve that matched his grip exactly. Jasper set the bristles against the concrete floor near the furnace and began the evening sweep. Shush, 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 shush. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The bristles moved across concrete with a grainy whisper, gathering the day's debris into small piles that caught the fading light. There were the obvious shards, chunks of glass from a broken wine glass stem, pieces he deliberately knocked off a sculpture that wasn't working. But there was also the invisible stuff, the fine glass dust that coated everything, the tiny particles that made the sunset light so magical and also required careful cleaning. He swept in long, even strokes, covering the main work area and overlapping passes. The physical motion, the gentle push, the slight pull back, the step to the side settled something in his nervous system. This wasn't about cleanliness, though a clean studio mattered. This was about ritual, about creating order, about sweeping away not just glass fragments, but the day's accumulated small tensions. The piece that cracked unexpectedly. The customer who'd called asking why her commissioned vase wasn't ready yet. The moment at lunch when he'd seen another glassblower say work and felt that ugly flash of comparison, of not good enough. Shush, 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 shush. The broom made everything level again. The floor became smooth under his attention. The debris gathered into a small pile in the corner, a colorful mound that he'd sort later, separating reusable cullet from trash. Some of these shards would go back into the furnace, would become molten again, would transform into new pieces. Nothing was truly wasted in glass, just changed. He swept around his workbench under the pipe rack behind the door where dust always accumulated. The light through the windows had shifted again, no longer honey or rose, but something deeper, like plum skin, like the moment just before twilight commits fully to night. A sound from the back of the studio made him pause. Not glass this time, something earthier. A heavy, rhythmic snore with a slightly wheezy quality, deeply contented. Basker. Jasper leaned his broom against the wall and walked to where his dog had claimed the evening's best spot. Basker was a basset hound, 12 years old now, with a white muzzle and ears that seemed designed by someone who'd been told to make the longest, silkiest, most absurd ears possible. He was sprawled on his side on a patch of concrete near the back door, where cool air seeped in through the gap at the threshold. His ears were spread out like velvet fans framing his head. His barreled chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. One of his back paws twitched occasionally, chasing something in dog dreams. Jasper crouched down carefully, knees protesting again, and rested his hand on Basker's warm side, feeling the inhale and exhale, the absolute commitment to rest that dogs seem to understand instinctively. He'd adopted Basker from the county shelter 9 years ago. The dog had been 3 then, surrendered because his previous owners were moving. Jasper had gone to the shelter looking for company, thinking maybe a small, energetic dog. But Basker had looked at him from his kennel with those droopy, soulful eyes, and something had clicked into place. The shelter volunteer had warned him, "Basset hounds are stubborn. They're bred for stamina, not speed. They'll follow a scent for hours, but they also have no shame about napping. They're bed hogs, they snore. They drool. Perfect," Jasper had said, and Basker had been perfect. Not in the magazine photo way, but in the way that mattered. He was present. When Jasper worked, Basker was there. When Jasper ate lunch, Basker materialized hopefully nearby. When Jasper had fallen apart 3 years ago, shaking and exhausted, Basker had simply laid his heavy head on Jasper's lap and stayed there for 2 hours. Dogs didn't fix things, but they reminded you that presence mattered, that breath mattered, that sometimes the most important thing you could do was find a cool spot and settle in completely. Now Basker was old. His muzzle had gone white. He moved slower. He chose his moments of activity carefully and his moments of rest without any guilt whatsoever. He never seemed to think, "I should be doing something." He just existed, fully committed to whatever the current moment required. Jasper envied it. The complete lack of productivity anxiety. The way Basker could be asleep and somehow seem accomplished. He gave the dog's side one more pat and stood up, his knees making their small complaints again. Basker's snoring continued undisturbed, a bass line to the studio's evening music. The glass pieces in the kiln added their occasional tinks and plinks. Together, they created something like a lullaby. Jasper walked to the small sink in the corner, an industrial utility sink, stained with years of use, and reached for his tin cup. It hung on a hook, dented and perfectly sized for his hand. He ran the tap until the water turned cold, that slightly metallic taste that came from old pipes, and filled the cup to its brim. The sound of water pouring was satisfying. Glug, glug, glug. The pitch changed as the cup filled, rising slightly. When it was full, he turned off the tap and lifted the cup to his lips. Cold, almost shockingly cold against his heat-dried mouth. He drank slowly, feeling the water travel down his throat, into his chest, spreading coolness through him. He'd been dehydrated all day, the heat of the furnace, the focus that made you forget basic needs like water. His body accepted the water gratefully, the slight lightheadedness he'd been ignoring beginning to clear. He drank a second cup, then a third. Thirst, he thought, was a strange thing. You could ignore it for hours, pushing through, telling yourself you'd drink water later. And then, when you finally did, you wondered why you'd waited. The relief was immediate and profound. Rest was the same. You ignore the signs, the tight shoulders, the shortened temper, the feeling that everything required enormous effort. You tell yourself you'll rest later, after this next project, after you prove something, after you earn it. And then when you finally do rest, when you finally give yourself permission to cool down, you wonder why you'd been so cruel to yourself. He set the cup down on the edge of the sink, watching condensation form on its exterior, tiny droplets gathering and sliding down the dented metal. His eyes drifted to his desk, a salvage door laid across 2 filing cabinets. and landed on the object sitting in the place of honor, the lumpy potato galaxy. Jasper walked over and picked it up, feeling its familiar weight settle into his palm. It was supposed to be a paperweight. More specifically, it was supposed to be a masterpiece paperweight, a swirling galaxy captured in glass, deep blues and silvers with tiny suspended stars, the kind of thing that would make people gasp and ask how much it cost. He'd had the vision so clearly, had mixed the colors himself, had planned the choreography of the gather and the first bubble, and the moment he'd add the silver leaf. He'd seen it finished in his mind before he'd even started. What emerged from the process looked like a very shiny, very expensive potato with some confused glitter. The blue had muddled instead of swirled. The silver leaf had clumped. The shape, which was supposed to be a perfect sphere, had developed a distinct lumpiness that suggested maybe a potato, maybe a kidney bean, maybe just pure chaos. There was one good swirl on one side, a moment where the glass had actually done what he'd envisioned, but the rest was pure disaster. 6 months ago, this would have gone directly into the cullet bin. Would have been smashed in frustration, the evidence destroyed. He used to hide his failures, used to feel each imperfect piece as a personal indictment. But something had shifted. Maybe it was therapy. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was Basker's influence, the way the dog had no concept of failure, only experiences. So he'd kept it, put it on his desk. When people asked about it, and they always did, because it was prominently displayed, he called it a deconstructed cosmic interpretation, and watched them try to figure out if he was serious. Sometimes he was. Art was subjective. Sometimes ugly things had value precisely because they refused to be what you expected. The paper weight was heavy, solid. It did its job perfectly, holding down the stack of orders and receipts that always threatened to scatter, and every time he looked at it, he smiled. It reminded him that not everything had to be perfect to matter, that sometimes the things that didn't work out the way you planned became the things you treasured most. He set it back down gently, giving it a small pat. From the kiln came a new sound. Tick, tick, tick. Not the glass this time, but the metal housing of the kiln itself, contracting as it cooled from the outside in. It was a different pitch than the glass, more metallic, more rhythmic. Like a clock, but slower, more irregular. Jasper returned to his leather chair and settled in deeply, feeling it embrace him in its familiar way. The studio was almost dark now, the last of the twilight fading from the windows. He hadn't turned on the overhead lights, just a small hanging bulb near the door, which cast a gentle yellow glow that didn't quite reach the corners, and the faint orange emanation from the kiln's seams. Tick, 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 plink. The studio was singing its transformation song. Invisible processes happening in metal and glass, molecules settling, stresses releasing, everything cooling at its own necessary pace. He couldn't see any of it. The magic was hidden inside opaque boxes and solid walls, but he trusted it. That was the thing about annealing. It required faith. You put your work in the kiln, you set the program, and then you stepped back. You couldn't open the door to check. You couldn't rush it along. You could only trust that the process you set in motion would do what it was designed to do. Trust was hard for him, always had been. Trust in other people that had been damaged early in a childhood where adult promises often evaporated like morning dew. Trust in himself that had been shattered by the burnout, by the discovery that willpower and determination couldn't actually override basic human limitations. He'd pushed until he broke, and then hadn't trusted himself for years afterward, afraid he'd break again. But glass had taught him something. You could trust processes even when you couldn't trust outcomes. You could set up the right conditions and then let go. The kiln didn't require his anxiety to work. It didn't need him to hover or worry or check on it every 15 minutes. It just needed him to program it correctly and then leave it alone. Maybe people were the same. Maybe he was the same. Maybe the annealing hour of the mind Dr. Rayna's phrase worked the same way. You created the conditions. You removed yourself from heat and demands. You programmed in time and gentleness and patience. And then you trusted that the cooling down would happen, that the stresses would release, that you'd settle into yourself without shattering. The light from the kiln pulsed very slightly, or maybe it was his imagination. The pieces inside were still cooling, still glowing faintly, still on their journey from molten to permanent. By morning they'd be cool enough to touch, to remove, to discover whether they'd survive the transformation. Some wouldn't. That was part of glass. Sometimes, despite perfect technique and careful annealing, a piece would crack, an invisible inclusion in the glass, a stress you didn't account for, the mysterious alchemy of sand and fire that sometimes simply refused to cooperate. He used to take those failures personally. Now he understood they were just information. This didn't work. Try something different next time. The glass wasn't rejecting him. It was just being glass with all its material limitations and possibilities. Jasper let his head rest against the back of the chair. The leather was cool against his neck. His shoulders, which had been hunched for hours, finally released downward. He could feel his spine settling, vertebrae finding their proper spacing, muscles letting go of their day-long grip. He did a mental inventory of the day, a practice Dr. Rayna had taught him. Not judgment, just observation. The 2 small vessels had gone well. He'd been in flow, that state where time disappeared and the glass seemed to know what he wanted before he asked. The bowl had been fine, competent, exactly what the customer ordered. The goblets had surprised him. He'd planned for them to be identical, but in the making they'd each developed their own character. One was slightly taller. The other had a handle that curved more dramatically. He liked them better this way. Perfect matching was for machines. Handmade things should carry evidence of hands. The wind sculpture was uncertain. It might be beautiful. It might be a disaster. He wouldn't know until tomorrow when the annealing was done and he could see it in natural light, could hold it and feel whether it had captured anything real or whether it was just glass shaped like a guess. But unlike 3 years ago, the uncertainty didn't make his stomach clench. It was just part of the process. The not knowing, the waiting, the discovery. He let the thoughts pass through without gripping them. Like heat dissipating from the kiln, they moved through his awareness and then away. No planning tomorrow's work. No replaying the difficult customer phone call. No spinning in circles about whether he should raise his prices or expand to include workshops or any of the other business anxieties that could fill infinite hours if he let them. Just this, the chair, the breathing, the studio sounds. Basker's snoring seemed louder in the darkness, or maybe Jasper was just more aware of it. That wheeze, snort wheeze rhythm that meant deep sleep, total surrender. The dog's presence was like an anchor, a reminder that this moment was real and safe and enough. The studio smelled like it always did in the evening. The faint chemical tang of propane, the concrete dust that never quite settled, something faintly sweet from the beeswax he used for making molds. Familiar. Home. His phone was in his pocket, but he didn't reach for it. That was another thing he'd learned. The phone could wait. The messages could wait. The emails and the social media and the endless scroll of content designed to convince you that you were missing something important. It could all wait. Nothing was on fire. Nobody needed emergency glass repair at 9 o'clock at night. The world would continue spinning whether he checked his notifications or not. This was his annealing hour, the cool down, the settling, the time when he stopped processing and started just being. Dr. Reyna had explained it using the same glass metaphor he'd offered her. Your brain is like that kiln. It needs time at a lower temperature, not thinking hard thoughts, not solving problems, not being productive. Just existing. That's when the stress releases. That's when you become permanent instead of brittle. He'd protested at first. But I need to plan tomorrow. I need to return emails. You need to not shatter, she'd said gently. Everything else is secondary. So he'd learned. Slowly, with backsliding and resistance and days when he filled the quiet with noise out of sheer habit. But gradually the annealing hour had become sacred. This time usually around sunset, when he stopped asking things of himself and simply existed in the space he'd created. The kiln ticked, the glass pinged occasionally. Basker snored his wheezy contentment. Jasper's breathing had slowed without him noticing. His chest rose and fell in rhythm with some deeper pace, something underneath thought. His hands, which had gripped and spun and shaped all day, rested loosely on the arms of the chair, empty and easy. He thought about the people who bought his glass. They saw the finished pieces in galleries or on his website. They saw the beauty, the color, the way light moved through curved forms. They didn't see this part, the waiting, the cooling. The hours of invisible process that determined whether their bowl or vase or sculpture would last for decades or crack on a random Tuesday afternoon. Most people live the same way. They showed the finished pieces, the accomplishments, the moments of visible magic. They didn't talk about the annealing hours, the time spent cooling down, settling, releasing stress. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't photograph well. It looked, from the outside, like nothing, but it was everything. Without this, he'd shatter. He knew that now. He'd done it before the burnout had been his shattering, the moment when internal stresses he'd ignored for years had finally torn him apart. The shaking hands, the insomnia. The morning he stood in his studio and realized he couldn't remember why he started doing this work in the first place, couldn't feel anything except exhaustion and dread. It had taken months to recover. Therapy, medication for a while, long conversations with Dr. Reyna about what rest actually meant, about how productivity culture had poisoned his relationship with his own worth. Slowly rebuilding, like heating glass back up and reshaping it, but more carefully this time, with more attention to the cooling process. Now he guarded this time fiercely. The annealing hour was non-negotiable. Friends had learned not to call during this window. Customers knew he didn't answer emails after 6. The studio door was locked, the outside world kept at a gentle distance. Not because he didn't care about people or his work, but because caring required that he be whole, and wholeness required rest. The darkness in the studio was complete now, except for the small bulb, and the kill's glow. The window showed nothing but reflection, his own ghostly outline in the chair, Basker's long form on the floor, the shapes of his tools and workbenches turned into shadows. Tomorrow the sun would rise. The kiln would finish its program and beep gently, announcing completion. He'd open the door and carefully remove today's pieces, discovering what had survived, what had cracked, what had exceeded his expectations. He'd start the furnace again, would heat new glass to molten, would shape new pieces with breath and spin and the accumulated skill of years. But tonight he was cooling, settling, releasing the day's heat and demands. He was annealing. Tick, tink, wheeze, snort. Tick, tick. The studio's lullaby continued, patient and unhurried. Molecules were shifting. Stresses were releasing. Transformation was happening invisibly, thoroughly, at exactly the pace it needed to happen. Jasper closed his eyes, though the darkness was the same either way. He let his awareness rest on his breath, on the sounds, on the way his body felt held by the chair. No thinking required. No planning, no productivity. Just the cool down, just the settling into shape, just a trust that slow processes done right produced things that lasted. After a long time, he had no idea how long, had stopped tracking time in minutes and started measuring it in breaths. Jasper opened his eyes again. He felt settled, cooled, ready eventually for rest. He stood slowly, feeling each joint articulate, each muscle lengthen. Basker heard the movement and lifted his head, ears falling comically to either side, eyes barely open. "Come on, old man," Jasper said softly. "Let's go home." Basker heaved himself up with the careful choreography of an elderly dog, front legs first, then the back end hoisted into position. A small shake to settle everything into place. He waddled over to Jasper, tail doing its slow, contented wag. Jasper did a final check of the studio. The furnace was set to its overnight temperature. The kiln was running its program, the controller's small digital display showing the current temperature and time remaining. The door was closed on the glory hole. His tools were racked. The swept pile of glass in the corner could wait until tomorrow. Everything was exactly as it should be. He picked up his jacket from the hook by the door and shrugged into it. The evening air outside would be cool, maybe cold. January in the valley meant winter, though rarely snow. Just the clean, cold air that made stars sharp. Basker waited by the door, patient as always. Jasper flipped off the small light, leaving only the kiln's glow to illuminate the space. He stepped outside and Basker followed. The lock clicked into place with its familiar sound, the closing of one container, the day sealed inside to finish its transformation. The night air was exactly as he'd imagined, cool and clean, carrying the scent of winter grass and distant wood smoke. Above, stars were emerging, pinpricks in the darkening sky. The moon hadn't risen yet, leaving the darkness almost complete except for the small light over his studio door and the distant glow of the town. His truck was parked 20 feet away, a battered Ford that had hauled glass and equipment for 12 years. Basker waddled toward it, knowing the routine. Jasper would open the passenger door first, would help the old dog climb up into the seat. Then he'd walk around to the driver's side, would start the engine, would drive the 15 minutes home to his small house where dinner waited to be made and a comfortable bed waited for both of them. But for just a moment he stood still in the darkness, breathing the cold air, feeling the day settle into memory. In the studio behind him, the kiln was doing its work. temperature dropping in precise increments, glass molecules shifting and settling, stresses releasing. The pieces inside were becoming permanent, becoming strong, becoming ready for the world. The same was happening to him every day. Every annealing hour, the fire shaped you. That was true. The heat and the pressure and the rapid decisions, they mattered. But it was the cooling that determined what you became. The rest, the patience, the willingness to stop demanding and simply exist at a lower temperature, letting stress dissipate naturally, trusting the process you couldn't see or control. Without the annealing hour, everything shattered eventually. With it, you became something that could hold beauty, hold function, hold light. You became permanent instead of brittle. You became the shape you were meant to be. Jasper smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow he'd open the kiln and discover what had survived. Tomorrow he'd heat new glass and make new things. Tomorrow would bring its own demands and its own rewards. But tonight the cooling was enough. Tonight he was exactly where he needed to be. He walked to the truck, opened the door for Basker, helped his old friend up into the seat. The dog settled immediately, claiming the space as his own. Jasper closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side, his boots crunching on gravel. Before he got in, he looked back at the studio one more time. The small building sat quiet in the darkness, light glowing from the high windows where the kiln worked its invisible magic. Smoke drifted from the furnace's chimney, almost invisible against the night sky. It looked peaceful, complete, a space where transformation happened at exactly the pace it needed to happen. He got into the truck and started the engine. The heater would take a few minutes to warm up, but that was fine. He wasn't in a hurry. Basker shifted in his seat, settling his head against the armrest, already halfway back to sleep. Jasper put the truck in gear and began the drive home, leaving the studio to its nighttime work, trusting that in the morning something beautiful would be waiting. The road unwound in front of his headlights. The night air flowed cool through the slightly open window. Above, the stars continued their slow wheel across the sky, unhurried and eternal. And in the studio, in the darkness, in the patient heat of the annealing oven, glass was settling into permanence. Stresses were releasing. Molecules were finding their rest. The cooling continued. The transformation was almost complete. And that, Jasper thought as he drove through the quiet night with his old dog beside him, was exactly how it was supposed to be. If this story resonated with you, please consider showing your support with a like, and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more quiet nights and restful journeys. May you find your own annealing hour, your own time to cool and settle, your own permission to become permanent instead of brittle. Rest well,